Generation X were the latchkey kids, the last generation that left the house after breakfast, vanished into the neighbourhood, and didn't come back until the streetlights flickered on. No cell phones, no GPS trackers, no parental check-ins, just a vague understanding that you'd better be home when those amber lights buzzed to life, or you were going to hear about it. This is the story of the last generation that played outside until dark, how that world disappeared, and why so many people are now fighting to bring it back. If you grew up in the 1970s or 1980s, if you're a Gen X kid who remembers that world, your childhood had a texture that's almost impossible to explain to a kid today. You woke up on a Saturday morning, poured yourself a bowl of cereal, watched some cartoons, and then you were out the door, gone. Your parents didn't know exactly where you were, and they didn't need to. You were somewhere in the neighbourhood, on your bike, in the woods, at the creek, building a ramp out of plywood and cinder blocks, playing kick the can in somebody's backyard. You drank water from the garden hose. You settled your own arguments. You fell out of trees, scraped your knees, and walked it off. This wasn't unusual. This was just childhood. Generation X, born roughly between the mid-1960s and 1980, grew up with a level of independence that now sounds almost fictional. They were the latchkey kids, a term that entered the language because millions of them came home from school to an empty house, let themselves in with a key around their neck, made themselves a snack, and handled their own afternoons. Mom was at work, Dad was at work, and the kids? The kids were fine. They had each other, they had the neighbourhood, and they had the kind of unsupervised freedom that built resilience, creativity, and a very high tolerance for scraped elbows. But something changed, and it changed faster than most people realise. Take 1969 for a moment. That year, 48% of American children between the ages of 5 and 14 walked or biked to school. If you lived within a mile of your school, that number climbed even higher, to 89%. Nearly 9 out of 10 kids just walked out the front door and made their own way to the classroom. It was normal. It was expected. Schools were built in the centre of communities specifically so kids could get there on their own. By 2009, that 48% had plummeted to 13%. By 2017, roughly 10% of kids walked or biked to school at all, and those children living within a mile, only 35% were making the trip on foot, compared to 89% a generation earlier. The sidewalks got emptier, the bike racks got dustier, and the pickup line at school got longer and longer and longer. So what happened? How did we go from a world where childhood meant freedom to a world where a 10-year-old walking to a park alone could get his mother arrested? The answer begins, strangely enough, with milk cartons. On May the 25th, 1979, a 6-year-old boy named Ethan Patz disappeared in Lower Manhattan. He was walking 2 blocks to his school bus stop, the first time his parents had ever let him make that walk alone. He never arrived. His face later became one of the first images of a missing child printed on a milk carton by the National Child Safety Council. 2 years later, on July the 27th, 1981, 6-year-old Adam Walsh vanished from a Sears department store in a Hollywood, Florida shopping mall. His kidnapping and murder devastated the nation. His father, John Walsh, channeled his grief into a crusade that reshaped American culture, going on to create and host America's Most Wanted, and becoming the driving force behind the founding of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in 1984. That same September, the Anderson Erickson Dairy in Des Moines, Iowa, began printing photographs of missing children on milk cartons. The faces of Johnny Gosh, a 12-year-old paperboy who disappeared on his morning route in Des Moines, and Eugene Martin stared out from breakfast tables across America. Other dairies followed. Suddenly, every morning, children were eating their cereal under the watchful, frozen gazes of kids who had disappeared. The idea was well-intentioned, and there were genuine successes. 7-year-old Bonnie Bullock spotted her own photo on a milk carton while in Colorado, showed it to a friend who told her parents, and Bullock was eventually reunited with her father after being taken during a custody dispute. But here's what most people don't know. The vast majority of children pictured on those milk cartons hadn't been snatched by strangers. They'd been taken by non-custodial parents in divorce situations. The stranger abduction epidemic that America believed was sweeping the nation was, statistically speaking, not what it appeared to be. In 1982, CBS Evening News told viewers that up to 50,000 American children were being kidnapped by strangers every year. 50,000. That number was staggering and also wildly, almost incomprehensibly exaggerated. According to the Department of Justice, the actual number of children abducted by strangers runs about 115 per year out of roughly 800,000 missing children reports. Fewer than 1% of cases reported to the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children are classified as non-family abductions. By the late 1980s, paediatrician Benjamin Spock was publicly criticising the milk carton programme, arguing that the images were terrifying small children at the breakfast table and filling them with the fear that they could be next. Dairies eventually stopped printing the pictures altogether. The milk carton campaign would eventually evolve into more sophisticated systems, most notably the Amber Alert system, launched in 1996, which now coordinates law enforcement and media in real time when a child abduction is confirmed. But the damage from the earlier panic was already done. The stranger danger era had fundamentally rewired the American parent's brain. The fear didn't vanish when the milk cartons did. It spread, quietly, becoming the background radiation of modern parenting. And it changed everything. By the 1990s, the radius around the home where children were allowed to roam on their own had shrunk to 1/9 of what it had been in 1970. 1/9. If a kid in 1970 could explore a mile in every direction from home, by the 1990s that circle had collapsed to roughly a city block. The neighbourhood shrank, the world got smaller, and childhood got a whole lot more supervised. Now, fear wasn't the only force at work. The infrastructure changed too. Schools migrated from city centres to suburban outskirts, and when you build a school on the edge of town, kids can't walk there anymore. You need a car, you need a parent, you need a system. In 1969, 41% of students between kindergarten and 8th grade lived within a mile of school. By 2009, that number had dropped to 31%. But fear was the accelerant, and it spread. And as the fear spread, a new style of parenting spread with it. Where Generation X parents had largely been left to fend for themselves, a new model emerged that researchers began calling helicopter parenting. Parents who hovered constantly, who scheduled every hour, who intervened in every conflict, who never let a child experience risk, boredom, or consequence on their own. Helicopter parenting became the cultural default, and free-range childhood became something that required justification, or in some cases, a lawyer. Something else was happening at the same time, something quieter, but in many ways more transformative. Screens were creeping into childhood, and once they arrived, they never left. The decline of the play-based childhood started in the 1980s, but it was the early 2010s that delivered the knockout blow. That's when smartphones became ubiquitous, and social media became the dominant social architecture for young people. Jonathan Haidt, a social psychologist at NYU, pinpoints 2012 as the year childhood fundamentally shifted from play and independence to screens and social media. In his 2024 book, The Anxious Generation, He argues that this great rewiring of childhood triggered an epidemic of mental illness. His earlier book, The Coddling of the American Mind, co-written with First Amendment scholar Greg Lukianoff, had already laid the groundwork, arguing that the impulse to protect young people from discomfort, risk and failure was itself making them fragile. The data backs him up. After more than a decade of relative stability, the mental health of adolescents collapsed in the early 2010s, with rates of depression, anxiety, self-harm and suicide rising sharply, more than doubling on most measures. Today, according to Common Sense Media, children between the ages of 8 and 12 spend an average of 4 to 6 hours per day on screens for non-school purposes. For teenagers, that number climbs to 7 or more hours. By the age of 8, the average child will have spent 1 full year of their life sitting in front of a screen. Discretionary screen time among children has jumped 50% in less than a decade. And here's a detail that should stop you cold. Average 8-year-olds today are better able to identify cartoon characters than native species like beetles and oak trees in their own community. They know the digital world intimately. The real one, not so much. Richard Louv saw this coming. In 2005, he published Last Child in the Woods, a book that coined the term nature deficit disorder to describe the growing disconnect between children and the natural world. Louv went on to found the Children and Nature Network, an organisation that works with researchers, educators and policymakers to reconnect young people with the outdoor world. He argued that this disconnect wasn't just sad, it was harmful, and that kids who don't play outside, who don't climb and run and get dirty and take risks, suffer real consequences in their physical health, their mental health and their cognitive development. One fifth grader he quoted in the book summed up the new reality perfectly. The kid said, "I like to play indoors better because that's where all the electrical outlets are." Research from the United Kingdom in the 2000 to 25 confirmed what Louv had warned about. Children now engage in 50% less unstructured outdoor activity than previous generations, with only 27% playing outside regularly. Lead researcher Dr. Mark Ferguson put it directly, "Outdoor play is essential for children's growth and development, and our finding of a decline in playing outdoors is worrying because it is linked to various health issues, including obesity, anxiety and depression." So we raised a generation on fear of strangers who almost never came, handed them devices that kept them indoors, restructured communities so they couldn't walk anywhere on their own, and then wondered why they were anxious. Lenore Skenazy has a way of cutting through that irony. In 2008, she wrote a newspaper column explaining why she let her 9-year-old son ride the New York City subway alone. The reaction was volcanic. She was labelled America's worst mom and vilified on the cable news. She didn't back down. She published Free Range Kids, a book making the case that modern childhood had become suffocatingly overprotected. She went on to co-found Let Grow, a non-profit dedicated to restoring childhood independence, alongside Jonathan Haidt and Dr. Peter Gray, a psychology professor at Boston College. "It's almost like we're killing kids with kindness," Skenazy has said. "We keep wondering, why are kids so anxious? Why are they bad at problem solving? Why are they so passive in class? Well, it's because there's always been an adult there." Dr. Peter Gray puts it even more starkly. "When I give talks to parents about children's need for independent activity, and I really mean need, this is like food and water, not a luxury. Not a luxury, a need, like food, like water. And yet parents who try to provide that independence are sometimes treated like criminals." In 2024, a Georgia mum named Brittany Patterson was charged with reckless conduct after her 10-year-old son walked to town without telling her. Police came to her home, handcuffed her in front of her children and threw her in jail. A Kentucky mother named Kay Eskridge had the authorities called on her because her 8-year-old daughter was riding a bike on their own street. A neighbour had called because she was upset to find a child outside. A child, outside, on her own street. But a counter-movement is building, and it's gaining real traction. In 2018, Utah became the first state to pass a free-range parenting law. Governor Gary Herbert said at the signing, "We believe that parents know and love their children better than anybody. Responsible parents should be able to let kids be kids without constantly looking over their shoulders for approval." Utah's law clarified that letting your kids play outside, walk to school, wait briefly in the car, or come home with a latchkey is not neglect. 8 states have since passed similar reasonable childhood independence laws, and in 2026, a bipartisan federal bill called the Promoting Childhood Independence and Resilience Act was introduced in Congress, co-sponsored by both Republican and Democratic representatives. The bill would amend the Federal Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act to make clear that age-appropriate independence, like walking to a park or playing outside unsupervised, does not automatically equal neglect. Internationally, the 2025 Position Statement on Active Outdoor Play, building on a Canadian framework from 2015, now extends globally, stating plainly that active outdoor play promotes holistic health and well-being for people of all ages, communities and environments. And on June 11th, 2024, the United Nations observed the first ever International Day of Play, a formal recognition that play itself had become endangered enough to require its own Global Awareness Day. There's a fair debate about whether Generation X was truly the last to experience this kind of childhood. Some older Gen Z members push back on the narrative. They'll tell you they rode bikes and played outside until the streetlights came on too, at least in the late 1990s and early 2000s. That's true for some of them. The line isn't perfectly clean, because culture doesn't shift all at once. It shifts in waves, neighbourhood by neighbourhood, family by family. There's also a harder, less comfortable version of the Gen X story. Some people look back at all that freedom and see something else, not liberated childhood, but neglected childhood. As one writer put it, the reality is that we were abandoned by our boomer parents, the most self-absorbed generation in the history of the world, who were spending a lot of time finding themselves and not much time parenting. There's truth in that too. Not every latchkey kid felt free. Some of them felt alone. But here's what we know for certain. Something was lost. Whether you call it freedom or neglect, independence or abandonment, there was a quality to childhood in the 1970s and 1980s that no longer exists at scale. Kids negotiated their own conflicts. They assessed their own risks. They got lost and found their way home. They built the muscles of resilience, not in a therapist's office or a structured enrichment program, but in the wild, unsupervised laboratory of a summer afternoon. The pandemic made everything worse. Screen time that spiked during lockdowns never came back down. For many families, screens became the default activity, and breaking that pattern now feels overwhelming. As some observers have noted, kids have been strapped into the back seat of their own lives, dropped off, picked up, and overhelped. That's the helicopter parenting instinct taken to its logical extreme, and researchers across the board agree that children are paying the price. But there are parents right now, millions of them, who remember what it felt like to be a kid with nothing but a bicycle and a long afternoon. They remember the creek and the fort and the game that didn't end until someone's mum yelled from the porch. And they're trying to figure out how to give that back. Not all of it, because the world has changed. But some of it, the part that matters. The streetlights still come on every evening. They still cast that same amber glow. The question is whether anyone's coming home to them anymore.